We coming for that entire empire. Greetings and welcome to another episode of Educeumm. I'm here, Chy'Na Empress Beatrice, your host, and today I have with me Dr. Dave Fredrick. I am super excited because I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Fredrick in my PhD journey, and Dr. Fredrick has been crucial, right, to my journey so far, and just like my engagement with higher academics and with figuring out my place, you know what I'm saying, as a Black academic in these spaces. So first, we're just going to like kind of jump straight in. If you don't mind, Dr. Frederick, if you could please just introduce yourself, let us know like a little bit about who you are, the departments you are over at the University of Arkansas, and the classes that you currently teach, please.
Okay, I'm Dave Fredrick. I've been at the University of Arkansas for about 34, 35 years. I got my PhD way back when at USC in Los Angeles. Um, I think it was 1992. So I've been here a long time. I'm just stepping into the role of section head for classical studies at the University of Arkansas in the Department of World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. Got a long history in teaching with and through game design and video games, and that became a big part of my career about 15 years ago or so. I'm currently teaching Classical Studies 10103, Intro to Classical Studies Rome, which is, like the title suggests, it's like an overview of not just political history of Rome, but like religion and literature, mythology, as well as political history and social history. So it's pretty wide ranging, and it's been super relevant. Let's put it that way these days. And I'm also teaching a course, upper level course, 4,000 level course on sex and gender in ancient Rome. Also super relevant and super fun to teach. I'm teaching Intro to Game Design, like a second semester because it's spring. So remembering that, it seems like, oh, I'm teaching another class, Catullus, which is kind of a mixture of a Latin class with an interactive fiction class, because we're building an interactive fiction based on like the social information and history we have from, and also like poetic technique we get from Catullus.
Mm-hmm.
And that class, we're going to use this thing called meta-humans, only we're calling it meta-Romans. And the
Mm-hmm.
idea is that we're going to like capture the students' faces, but then we're going to use the tools that are in uh, meta-humans, which is by Epic Games. We're going to use those to like Romanize them, like
Mm-hmm.
Romans wore makeup, Romans had certain hairstyles in this period,
Okay.
things like that, and also try to hook that up with AI for chat.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like the students have they're stepping into that Roman identity,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly we want that to be critical. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you're still not them,
Right.
right? But
Mm-hmm.
but it makes them think about that distance,
Okay.
and so
Are they creating like scripts, or are they playing with the scripts, or like how is it
it's
happening?
kind of a mixture. There definitely are scripts and paths, like, and they're branching.
Mm-hmm.
So some students are responsible for this branch of the story, and some this branch, and some this branch. But at certain points, you can pause on that branch and interact with a Roman who's actually one of our students, but it has been trained,
Gotcha.
to be able to respond and carry a conversation to a certain point.
For
We don't know
sure.
what's going to happen, like how it will break, no doubt, in exciting ways.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that fight, it doesn't have to be perfect. I think the exercise itself is gonna be really good for their learning.
That's really cool. So I do have one other question. Are you like creating these storylines based on like research on like like a mythos? You know what I'm saying? Because I know there's a lot of stories and poems and scholarships. Or is it
Right.
um how are we gathering information to create? Yeah.
The jumping off place is the poetry of Catullus. It's short. It's like a short
Yes.
book, but it's filled with social information. He's
Mm,
very engaged in the politics of the Roman late Republic, like the time of Julius Caesar, who
okay.
shows up in the poems like a couple, three times.
Oh,
And so he's got sometimes really harsh things to say about people around him in Rome.
mm-hmm.
He's desperately in love with a woman he gives a pseudonym to of Lesbia.
Mm.
and that's really based on the poetry of Sappho.
Okay.
And so it's interesting for a Roman male poet to have this deep relationship with, first of all, a Roman woman. That's not odd, I suppose, named Claudia, who gets a lot of airplay, and a lot of it is by elite male Roman sources that are not positive. And Catullus is kind of psychotically hot and cold with Lesbia, like, I love you, I love you, I love you, oh, I'm so mad at you.
Mm-hmm.
So he goes through these different phases with Claudia, but he gives her the name Lesbia, and he even has his poetry is very influenced by Sappho,
Hmm.
by this much older Greek lyric poet who is female, who's a woman, and writes about same sex love
Hmm.
between women.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a really interesting move that you wouldn't anticipate from a male Roman poet.
Hmm.
But the reason why Sappho is having this influence partly is because of Catullus's poetic technique, which in the time period of the late Republic is super revolutionary.
Okay.
That's what blew my mind about this poet, upon discovering them.
Mm-hmm.
Is they're kind of, so this is getting maybe technical, but Latin doesn't have a definite article, the equivalent of a the,
Okay.
and already Latin word order can be pretty free. Like you can put, as long as the endings agree, you can put the words in any order.
Okay.
And the absence of the article makes that super free. And
Mm-hmm.
so Catullus is really the first poet to lean deeply into that. And
Mm-hmm.
it enables him to have all these dense, like, play of sounds, like alliteration and assonance, that's almost more important sometimes than what the words mean. It's like
Mm-hmm.
they're in this really complex relationship with each other. It's really rich, acoustically, texturally rich
That's
poetry.
cool. So how do
It's,
you know the vocal inflection based on the way the words are written?
what a great question. We actually have pretty, because of the Romance languages and their development, historical linguistics gives us a pretty good idea of what Latin sounded like. Pretty
Mm.
good. It's not, open and shut, but we have a lot of Latin inscriptions that are from various periods of Rome's history, including the late antiquity, right? And those inscriptions from late antiquity are, for instance, in other sources, graffiti, like from Pompeii,
Mm-hmm.
because people spell things the way they sound,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So from a lot of different sources, we're able to reconstruct Latin pronunciation. And we insist a lot on reading aloud, both English and Latin in this class, because, of course, English poetry, the way to get it is to read it out loud. That's like
Mm-hmm.
you have to.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's performative, and certainly Catullus is performative. But it's a real thing for your mind to try to keep up with what's happening in the poetry, like what it means,
Yes.
while getting at its sound, at its texture, acoustically. So that's a super fun class. I love it.
Yes. My background is in, Pan African Black studies literature. And so you talking about that is making me think about Black English and the
Yeah,
way that they often um, describe differences in Black English to like American English styles. In particular, I'm thinking about Baldwin's, he did this really good article on, why Black English isn't a language. Anyway, he talks about the use of the word jazz in the 1970s, right? And the way a jazz can mean 100 different things. It can mean jazz, the music can mean jazz, sexy jazz. You know what I'm saying? Just depends on
yeah,
how. So you can say one word and vocal inflection, right? As well as
yeah,
what
yeah,
you put
yeah,
around the word, right,
yeah,
will change the meaning of the word itself, right? And so, even though I'm not familiar with Catullus, while you were speaking, this is what I'm seeing in my head. I'm seeing that it playing based on the way the words are in the middle, because you said that only the ending has to be consistent, and
yeah,
then vocal inflection on the way that those words play, right? So I think that's really, really cool. And I also think that it kind of speaks to like one of the main questions that I wanted to ask you about is, which is like the way that we understand or perceive Rome culturally, right? Versus what it may have really looked like at that time. Because I would assume, you know what I'm saying, that artists, popular people, right? You know what I'm saying? Because Catullus and whoever you were like speaking about before, like those were people who have obviously come to some type of popularity based on their artistry, you know what I'm saying? Things of that
yeah,
nature. And they often reflect the environment from which they come, right?
yeah, yeah,
The merging of different cultures and, sounds, right? And things of that nature. And so for you to say that it was something odd, you know what I'm saying, for a male to do in that period. I would like to know a little bit more about like what the space looked like at that time. You know what I'm saying? Is it an all white space like we see in movies and on, you know, in a lot of the imagery, right? A lot of the
Yeah.
paintings that you find of Rome, you only kind of see white people, but then you'll have like these conversations with some people about like the Moors, and there were black people there, and
Hmm.
there were obviously lesbian and gay couples there as well. But a lot of times it's kind of pushed to the side, and the freedom, the sexual freedom that I think depending on what conversations that you have, you know what I'm saying, that you find around. Can we just talk about what Rome might have actually looked like versus its ide- idealization, for lack of a better word, and
Hmm.
how that misinformation or disinformation is I don't know, is doing something.
Yeah. Oh, it's doing a lot. Rome's having a moment, and it's not totally a good moment. And that moment plugs into a whole long history of how Rome's been perceived and represented and used as kind of a model Western, quote unquote, civilization. And that, of course, Rome was a republic. We could say a democratic republic, but it shifted from being a republic to being an empire,
Mm-hmm.
and not just in terms of the territory it controlled, but also the form of government. Like government moves from being a fairly, we could say oligarchical, but that's tricky for Rome, representative democracy to being what's typically portrayed as one man rule. And that
Mm-hmm.
transition from that democracy to that the imperator, the one guy
Mm-hmm.
ruling, that transition was hugely influential on our founders, on America's founders, who studied that a lot.
I have a quick
Yeah.
question.
Uh-huh.
This might be a silly question, but for clarity, so you're saying it moved from a republic to an empire, and then you
Yeah.
said democracy to
One person rule, like Augustus or Nero, like these Roman
gotcha.
emperors,
Could
which
you
are
explain
often
the
yeah.
connection between republic and democracy? Because I think a lot of people hear republic
Oh, okay. Kind of
and
like America. Yeah, yeah.
yes.
Yeah, gotcha. Like we live in a representative democracy. That is, we elect senators and representatives and at the state level and at the federal level. So we don't go and directly vote on most legislation,
Mm-hmm.
right? They do that, but they
Yes.
represent us.
Yes.
And Rome was quite similar to that in many respects, but in some important respects, not.
Okay.
But the thing is, in the first century BCE, like in the event most people know is like the assassination of Julius Caesar.
Yes.
And that is a punctuating moment in that transition from a republic, like a
Okay.
representative republic,
Mm-hmm.
to one man rule,
Gotcha.
which is often presented in absolute terms, like the emperor could do whatever he wanted
Mm-hmm.
and was totally above the law and like a fascist and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that history, and our founders looked at that history really closely.
Mm-hmm.
And our Constitution really is informed deeply by that Roman experience, much more so than ancient Greece.
Hmm.
So Greece might be the birthplace, quote unquote, of democracy, but Rome, for our Constitution, is much, much more influential. And so, what the founders were wanted to avoid is that what they viewed as a fall or a transition, a slipping from
Mm-hmm.
republic and people getting to vote and having representatives to one person rule.
Gotcha.
And you can see, like right now, why that's so intense, that comparison. Because a lot of the right wing today in American politics is claiming that we need a red Caesar. We need a
Mm.
Caesar, a one person ruler who's pretty much got absolute power.
Mm-hmm.
And there are even efforts to say that the American presidency was designed by the founders to be that, actually.
Mm.
And this is like, if you read any Madison, like James Madison, like or the Constitution period, or any of the founders speaking about that, in the 2 or 3 decades before, there's no way. That is absolutely untrue. And also, it's good to point out that Rome kind of got a blue Caesar. Like,
Mm.
and I'll talk through that here. And that is when we get deep into Roman history, like I'm going to say like 130s BCE, and BCE just means like BC.
Mm.
It's just how academics talk about it. But at that point, Rome already had a lot of territory. There was a lot of enslaved people pouring into the Italian peninsula.
Mm.
There'd been constant wars of conquest, basically. a lot of soldiers had been separated from their land. A lot of that land had been claimed by a fairly narrow slice of Rome's population, like a 1% of 1% on the elite side, and they didn't want to give it up,
Mm.
right, once they got it.
Mhm.
And that set the stage for real internal conflict in Rome
Mhm.
between politicians who were basically trying to champion the poorer in Rome getting some of that land, like redistributing land, which is a way of redistributing wealth right at
Mhm.
that time, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, and that comes to a head any number of times in that first century. And it's not only that, there's like all these people who have been separated from their land flood into the city,
Mm.
right? And so there's urban populations are swelling, and they're also swelling because Roman enslavement or slavery isn't like American slavery. It's
Mhm.
fundamentally different.
Mhm.
And that is a lot of enslaved people in cities were freed almost routinely,
Mhm.
right? And often by the age of 30 or so. Like they still have a significant productive life left.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it's not necessarily or usually an end of life freedom, it's a
Right.
midlife freedom, right?
You're right.
Now, those enslaved people are, on the whole, are not white and not European,
Mhm.
but they become part of Rome's citizen population.
Mhm.
So many are from North Africa, many from Egypt, many from Syria, many from Judea, many from like central parts of Turkey, like Cappadocia, the central part of Turkey. A
Mhm.
lot of them are from Greece,
Mhm.
right? So a whole bunch from the south and east parts of the Mediterranean basin,
Right.
right? And basically not European and not white. We have significant representations and they're not. But
Mm.
they come to Rome in large numbers, are freed in large numbers, become part of the citizen, and at that point, voting population of Rome. This is a thing you don't really see a lot of in representations of Rome, which are like everybody's white, and they're not.
Mhm.
Um, and already, even the Italian peninsula, we could try to claim it as like some kind of homogenous whiteness, but that's weird. And a lot of different languages already. That's the other thing,
Mhm.
right? So Rome has in it all of these different languages and cultural influences. And when an enslaved person gets freed, there isn't some subsequent test like, uh, you know, don't believe in your culture anymore, or don't worship your gods anymore, right? Or
Right.
don't have sex with this person or that person anymore. Like it's like they don't have that kind of like gatekeeping test.
Yes.
You're in.
Mhm.
And that makes Rome's citizen body quite diverse, like really diverse. And that fact is usually underappreciated, but not by our founders, right? They looked upon that, and politicians sort of driving what we might call the left wing issues, like we need grain for these people in the city that don't have food. We need to redistribute land. We need to, like, there's a lot of judicial corruption that we need to reform. All these issues kind of on the left,
Mhm.
right? The right wing, and there's two names like populares v optimates, like the
Mhm.
popular people versus the quote unquote best people.
Okay.
Well, the populares are going to win, and they're going to win in the form of Julius Caesar and then Augustus. So everything that had been fought for, like around 130s, 120s BCE, a lot of that comes to pass
Okay.
under, and that's why we would say a blue Caesar,
Oh.
right? Right on. So, right. And our founders looked at that and said, how did that happen? And it happened by an office named the Tribunes. The Tribunes proposed legislation to what was called the Concilium Plebis.
Mhm.
That was not representative. That was a direct vote,
Hmm.
right? And
Mhm.
so there was one assembly in Rome where you weren't represented, you went and voted directly on legislation.
Okay. Mhm.
Wow. And you can see that as Rome's population includes more and more freed, formerly enslaved people,
Mhm.
the voting body in that Concilium Plebis is becoming highly diverse,
Yes.
right? And they have a direct, like the laws you pass in the Concilium Plebis, the Council of the Plebes,
Mhm.
those are binding,
Oh, okay.
right? And
Yes.
so the founders are looking at that and saying, we don't need that. We're not going to have any sort of body at the federal government level in which people vote directly on legislation. They always have to
Ah,
have a representation in between,
gotcha. Okay.
right? And they also are like, nah, this office of the Tribune, it's a real problem,
Hmm.
right? And so we're going to have sort of like what we got, a lower house, the House of Representatives, which has many more representatives in it than senators.
Mhm.
And that will enable the fewer number of senators overall to have more weight, right,
Hmm.
in driving legislation.
Mm-hmm.
And at the House of Representatives level, right, that's going to be more tied to population,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But the Senate is 2 per state, no matter how many people.
Right.
Note the tremendous advantage that gives landowners in rural states.
Hmm.
And right, huge. That's not accidental. It's
Mm.
informed by the Roman example very deeply,
Hmm.
right? So it's really intense to think that way, but it really does. It's a necessary corrective for thinking of Rome as white and European,
Yeah.
right? And also in its way, because of its like enslavement, well, that's horrible. And yet there's for many urban enslaved people a path to freedom.
Right.
And that path is realized for many. They become voting citizens with no further like restrictions. It
Right.
didn't matter if you were black or from Judea, or were you Syrian, or were you Egyptian, or were you
Right.
Numidian from North Africa, or whatever. You're in,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was real concern about that among the founders. And of course, we had American slavery at that point, race based.
Okay.
So they were at pains not to have a path from race based enslavement to freedom,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
Right. And
Yes.
so, but nonetheless, of course, we're concerned about, well, if we don't have some counting of that population, then in terms of representation, for instance, in the House of Representatives, what a problem for the southern states if we only count the white people.
Right. Yeah. Because you
Is that
want to.
right? So
Yeah.
we'll make the black people like 3/5 of a human being in order for their population to count, right? For
Exactly.
white people to get representation. It's incredible,
Yes.
right? But it has
Right.
this intertwined relationship with Rome that's very important to understand now. First, because the founders in their way are quite anti-democratic,
Mm.
right? Quite,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? On
Mm-hmm.
the other hand, the founders are without question anti-tyranny,
Right.
right? And so when you try to say that somehow they wanted an imperial presidency, like nothing could be further from the truth, but it's
Right.
happening, right?
Right. It's so interesting. You used this word earlier, slippage, right? And it kind of just explained like everything that you kind of talked about, right? This slipping away, right? From either intentionally or unintentionally, right? But from what the original purpose was.
Well, and one could also say like where we were, like Rome went through like in the last phases of the Republic, right?
Mm-hmm.
These tensions of urban, poor but free or freed, of
Mm-hmm.
citizens, right, that have very little and want redistribution of stuff so that they can eat, right? Like, can we have land? Like, because that's the major driver of like wealth in antiquity.
For sure.
Even though there's like urban businesses and ways to make money that way, land is still a big deal. And those pressures and the resistance from the optimates rise to such a level that there are 3 major civil wars within about 40 years at the end of the Republic. That's like 80,000 people on each side fighting huge battles, thousands die.
For sure.
That is a crisis.
Yeah. That's terrifying.
Terrifying and incredible, right? The Romans were like, it really traumatized them
Yeah.
deeply. Now, I'm just telling you that, like, anxiety over DEI or wokeness is in no way comparable to that crisis that the Romans went through. We
Hmm.
don't have 80,000 woke people out with an army in Montana slaughtering the opposition. Like, that's
Mm.
insane. Like, it's
Yeah.
not even close.
No, it's
So,
not.
for people to lean in the last 30 years of American history and find it like somehow comparable and the level of stress and like fighting
Mm.
to the Roman experience, like that's
Mm.
absurd. It's an
Yes. Like
absurdity.
why are we drawing comparisons? But I think a lot of it though is because we don't really understand. Like when I learned the the value, that's the word I was looking for, the value of a good teacher, of a good instructor, you know what I'm saying,
Yeah.
to really make you understand what, to be able to talk to you in a way that you can relate what's happening in a way that is comparable, so that you're not making these big jumps, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. But like, yeah.
A lot of times I feel like they'll read something like I told you I was looking up a couple articles before I came, and so it's interesting. I found 3 articles and they were all vastly different. I shared the best one with you, right?
Yeah.
But one
Yeah.
was very much like, oh, we don't know what happened in Rome. All we really know about is Julius Caesar, but we know that white people. It was
Wow, man.
insane,
Wow.
and it came up on Google like immediately, and I think a lot of things, which you already know because you're into you understand about tech and law and algorithms and things of that nature. But like the algorithms are giving you what is clicked on the most, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
misinformation is what's clicked on the most. So people
Yeah.
understand that you got to kind of scroll through to go and find actual content, you know what I'm saying, that will speak to what is actually happening in the real world. But
Can
I
I?
think I was just interested because there are a lot of, like you said, a lot of comparisons right now to Rome, right? And to white greatness, right? And to and when we and I don't know if we want to use so, but like, but those are the words that they're using, right? I don't want
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
use words, right? But I think it's really interesting the slippage or the distance. I don't even know if dissonance is the right word from like from reality of the example that they're of the examples that they're trying to use, right? um so I thought it was really important to talk about the diversity, because I wasn't even
Yeah.
aware of the level of diversity that's happening in Rome. And like you said before, with the location that Rome is in, right, it is
Yeah.
kind of like in a spot where you are going to have a mix of people, if we're looking at the demographics that we have today and the spreading of cultures.
Yeah. No. What I'm trying to do here. Whoop, and it went away. I'm
Uh-oh.
trying to use the chat here, but I haven't used this platform before.
Okay, no worries.
Let me pull it over here because I got a little taken away. Let me try this.
hmm
Yeah. Okay. So
You should be able to share it too. Do you want to share a screen?
I can just paste it in the chat, I think,
Okay,
if you don't mind.
yeah, no
But
problem.
I see no. Let me see if I can. Oh, it looks like I might have to upgrade. Okay, here we go. Cool. So I just pasted in there. I'm going to send it to you now. This is a wonderful younger scholar, Nandini Pani at Johns Hopkins,
hmm
and I really just ran across her work like this week, like over the weekend.
hmm
Um, and it's a really amazing situation. A great book called The Poetics of Power in the Age of Augustus. And I think a forthcoming book this year, end of this year, maybe, on diversity in Rome.
mm,
Right, so that's going to be a major book.
okay.
But there's a long history of articles also that Nandini has produced. Yeah, that's going to Roman diversity. That's going to be a heavy hitter in this
hmm
field.
hmm
And Nandini is South Asian descent, ancestry, children of two immigrants, a woman of Southeast Asian descent, um, in the academy studying classics.
hmm
Right, so
You're
has a
actually
lot to say
talking
about that
about what
experience.
someone like you doing in classics.
100%.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow. And this book is 2024.
Yes.
Wow.
Well, it didn't quite make it, but soon, hopefully,
Right.
this
Well, I
book
mean,
comes
it's
out.
coming, right? That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're
Definitely.
dealing with this now. That's insane.
Yeah. No, just a great scholar, and I was really excited to find this work. But it speaks to a lot of the concerns that that people in classics, some of us have now to recognize and research and try to understand this diversity in Rome and what that experience was like,
Yes.
and to really just make it clear that Rome, it's not really European,
Mm.
and that claim is weird. And it's like a claim that it's Western, it's European, which almost always carries with it, and Christian.
Right.
And certainly Rome becomes Christian, but for a lot of the history, it just isn't. It's quite diverse in religious practice, like really diverse. And even early forms of Christianity are quite diverse.
That's what I was just about to. I was literally just about to say. So what? Then it makes you ask, what is Christianity, right? Because it's the
Yeah,
merging
yeah,
of all these different, and then especially when you talk about the history of Rome, right? And how when I think that's so interesting how people don't understand that when you conquer a nation, like you take in its people, right? Like like they don't disappear. You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
Genocide is not the norm, right? We don't usually just come in and can kill every single person that was part of the, like usually they like you bring them in, like, you know what I'm saying? And so if Rome is conquering all of these nations, that means that they are taking over all these cultures, all of these people, all of the, you know what I'm saying? And there's right.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and Rome could be horrible in that respect, and you don't want to sugarcoat it.
for sure, yeah,
So it depends on the type of resistance they meet.
yeah,
It depends on how long it takes. And there's some real examples, like Julius Caesar was in a hurry in Gaul. Like
Mm-hmm.
he needed that military glory fast. And so if you read the population, because he'll start by saying, and we encountered this tribe, like they had how many thousands of people.
Okay.
Then by the time we left, they had this many thousands left, right? And those death totals are probably exaggerated, but they're still staggering in what they
Right.
imply.
Right.
And there's a very famous speech that involves the Roman conquest of England, of Britain, and it's a remark to the effect that the Romans make a desert and then they call it peace.
Mm.
Really intense, right?
Mm.
So that it can be that Roman act of conquest can be near genocidal,
Okay.
but so that happens, right?
Yeah.
But on the
Yeah.
other hand, in many instances, it doesn't happen, and that's what you're talking about. Like in many
Yeah.
parts of the
For
Mediterranean,
sure. Yeah. And I'm also kind of speaking to like even when genocide does happen and when like these crazy wars, I guess what I'm also saying is I think that we, in the way that I think about it, because I've looked at films mostly and like Roman mythology,
yeah,
is we always think that there's like an overlord. You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
To
yeah.
make sure that no cultural practices happen and you cannot, right? And so what I'm saying is that after they conquered, there was not always enough people left there to stop the cultures from
Oh, of course,
or to make everybody
yeah.
Christian or to make everybody wear, a white robe. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like that I think that people assume that people automatically become monolithic, right?
Yeah, like
After
it's a cultural flattening, right?
right, right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah.
No, no, but to what you were saying, yes, thank you for saying that because that needs to be said, and I'm in 100% agreement.
Yeah, it's super important, and we just had this pretty terrible movie, which kind of showed some diversity, but in ridiculous ways, and that was Gladiator 2, building on the absurdity that was Gladiator 1,
Yeah.
and it's building on the long tradition of Roman movies in which we assume like the Romans all spoke with a British accent, except for the hero who's American. Like a lot of crazy stuff. Um, and I used to teach a course called Rome on Film, and so I really dug into that tradition. Some of the movies in it there's some surprisingly like interesting and ones that lean into diversity more. And one of those was Titus, which is
Hmm.
based on Titus Andronicus, and it was directed by Julie Taymor. Now, content warning: it's super violent, as Shakespeare's play is super violent. Um, but it is definitely an art piece and does really interesting things with that Roman heritage and the heritage of Roman films. But yeah, that tradition is there, and it's in cinema so much. Of the Romans are evil, fascist oppressors that speak with the British accent, but we're going to beat them because we're Americans. But the Americans are still going to be white, except for the black sidekick of the white hero,
Yeah.
like a classic, you know?
You know, it, and that's so funny you say because so that happens, and then like the only time, because my background is in theater and performance, right? And the classics, I will say, are the hardest thing to perform, right? Like they're almost impossible. But I feel like it's kind of like learning another language, and then you have to
Yeah,
emote it, and you want to make sure that people understand kind of in the vocal inflection of now, right? What's still staying true.
yeah, yeah,
Long story short, though, but the way to really upset a group of people is to have a non-traditional cast when it comes to classics. Any
yeah.
non-traditional cast when it comes to classics, like people are in an uproar, right? Do you know what I mean by that? Yeah.
It's so it's so incredible because I went to actually to Africa for the first time in 2023.
Oh wow.
I went to Tunisia. There's a lot of Roman remains in Tunisia, and they're incredibly well preserved and beautiful. Um, and of course, like it's this mix. You can feel it. Like it feels different. The archaeology, the structure of space is different,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a real mix, like Numidian, like population and way of building, way of like laying out space. But
Mm-hmm.
it's also Roman at the same time. You
Mm.
can feel the hybridity of it, like from antiquity.
Cool.
And there's amphitheaters and there's theaters. They're performing in those theaters. That's not in Rome. That's in North Africa. Many of the actors had to be like Gaetulian or Numidian, North African.
Yeah.
And there's a fairly famous writer called Apuleius from North Africa,
Hmm.
and probably spoke Punic, like this Phoenician-derived language, but also knew Gaetulian, like
Okay.
a North African language,
Okay.
knew Latin and Greek.
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And he just talks about that. Like, you would probably call me half Numidian, half Gaetulian. I don't really know, but I'm not ashamed of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a author, like, it's like those, that testimony happens. And I think it's very important because it speaks to that fluidity of language across this world. Is not just Latin and Greek. The ancient Mediterranean of Rome
Mm-hmm.
is far from that,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's so many different languages being spoken, and it reminds me because you know that painting that's up in Crystal Bridges, Winter Scene in Brooklyn. Have you seen that?
Let me look at that winter scene in Brooklyn. Okay.
Yeah, it's a huge historical canvas, and we were working for a while. Trying to make a video game experience that would pull you into that painting like you would inhabit it
Oh,
because
cool.
it's so big. And but we really dug into how it's like its composition, and it very much shows like how shall we say, the color line between
Mm.
black people and white people in its composition.
Mm-hmm.
So but it's because a winter scene in Brooklyn, and actually that very area of Brooklyn is where a lot of the like first African American institutions emerge. It's super important for Black history.
This is the right picture?
Yeah, that's the right picture.
Okay.
And it's like compositionally, you see like white people get to control the space. There's knots of like 3 and 4 and 5 people.
Mm-hmm.
Black people never exist except for groups of 2 at most,
Mm.
right? They're involved in labor, pushing things around. Their back is turned towards public space. Its
Hmm.
composition reflects, because we're right in New York at that time. We're in this period of transition between enslavement and like this gradual manumission or emancipation. And it takes like 20 or 30 years. But all the same, like there's this division between who gets to be at home and assertive in public space and
Mm.
who has to kind of hide their way through it. And we called that out, like what is happening there. And then we dug into like the history. There's a lot of written history of Brooklyn in this period.
Mm-hmm.
And you can recover a lot of the origin of Black institutions from this period. And
Hmm.
what dawned on us is that the Black people in that painting, the African Americans in that painting, knew West African languages. They knew Dutch. They knew English, right? Some of them knew French from the Caribbean. Like they are among the most linguistically masterful people in that painting.
Mm-hmm.
And that mix is what's informing like the emergence and long history of African American, like non-standard or whatever we're going to call it, African American English.
Oh, yes.
All
Uh-huh.
right, right.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, I was that blew me away, like the realization that mostly in American history, like American history in schools, nobody teaches you that,
Oh, no.
you know. But
Mm-hmm.
if we think about the Roman example, that's happening. Like these people who move into Rome from enslaved backgrounds, they know Syrian or they know Demotic Egyptian, but now they also know Latin. They probably know also maybe Punic, like, right? And so if you think, oh, you're learned, you know Latin, it was actually kind of a low bar,
Hmm.
right? For right, you get see what I'm saying?
Yes.
It's an amazing, and to me, now is the time when we're really starting, like as classicists, to lean into that experience and try to. It's so hard in terms of evidence,
Yeah.
but pulling together all the evidence we have, including comparisons, right, to different historical periods,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of pull that out and see what that feels like, right? And
Yeah,
knowing that you can never really, like, it's a mistake to think you can just leap across
for
that
sure.
gap, right? And
Yeah,
so, but also it's a huge mistake not to try,
for sure. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Anytime I think of like a bustling anything, I try to think of like what would that space have looked like, you know what I'm saying? Like a New York then, right? Because New York, like I think New York is
Yeah,
just like it's crazy, it's diverse.
yeah.
You have everybody is there. You know what I'm saying? They say you speak English. Like I can't understand nothing the New Yorkers say if they speak that much English. You know what I'm saying? Like what? You know? So like when I think of like anything that's like thralling and like busy and like because anytime you think of city, right, and move, and then think of movement, and then you said you can make money, but people associate land with money. I associate land with like stability, right? That I don't have
Yeah,
to work
yeah,
for somebody. I don't have to get up every single day. I can go out and go to my garden. That can fix me something to eat, right? But if I'm in
yeah,
the city, I can go out here and people got money in their pocket, right? And so,
yeah,
right, so I'm trying to use the money as a pocket, right? Like I'm trying to hustle. And so, and when I think of hustlers, I think of diversity, right? I think
yeah,
of
yeah,
culture, I think of language, I think of food. I think of, you know what I'm saying, activity. I think of entertainment, right? And so when I think of Rome, this is what I'm seeing in my head. I can't just see that like in the way that they make it seem. It's like Rome was like Bridgerton. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
exactly. Downton Abbey, right?
Yes, you know, and I'm like, there's no way if it was diverse, it could have had to be like New York. It couldn't be like Bridgerton, you know. And so I don't understand how people how do we go get to so much slippage, right? That we find
Yeah,
both, right? How can you have that amount of diversity and action and energy and liveliness and chaos? You know what I'm saying?
right,
In something
right.
that you want to be so structured and clean and monolithic, for lack of a better
Yeah,
word.
yeah. No, it's a major, like, it's a misrepresentation, obviously, but it's one driven by, the history, really the history of class and race
Mm,
in Europe and America.
mm-hmm,
Like, so trying to, like, we are like them, they are our cultural, like, ancestors. And so, and we privilege, like, what we perceive to be the whiteness of Rome, and almost monolithic nature of that,
mm-hmm,
and the whiteness of the marble, which we know was painted, right? And
mm-hmm.
and in Rome, like, it doesn't have any, like, bird crap on the monuments, and, like, Rome was full of fires and floods and buildings falling down. It was every part of a city that way.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I was really surprised when I found that out, and I found that out from you and Mike that Rome was painted. I thought it
Yeah.
was a white city. I had no idea. I like when I imagine Rome, I imagine like fake heaven. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
yeah, yeah. No,
You know.
these two things are on a parallel track almost, and that is recognizing that, traces of paint have been found on all kinds of monuments, on sculptures, on buildings, and that discovery and realization means that Rome doesn't look the way we thought it looked, like the way
Mhm,
we being presented as white and clean and sterile and all these things.
mhm,
There's two things happening. One is a lot of lived-in decay and dirt. That's one thing.
mhm.
Like any game, like art game director would be like an art director for games would be like, we need to dirty this up. People lived in here, right?
Right.
So that's one thing. The other thing is it was painted. Unfortunately, now, especially in digital efforts, there's not a lot of subtlety about it, and so it's almost like they took, like, a paint and dumped it on anything, like it
Mhm,
was stucco or anything. But
mhm,
actually, we know the paint is in this complex relationship to the marble underneath, and they also used marble of many different colors.
hmm,
Like, there's probably 20 plus forms of marble that are just part of the repertoire in Imperial Rome,
mhm,
and it's insane because people who know this, like, because their Rome there's all that marble, it's got to be restored. Like, people who are in that business,
mhm,
right? They know all that, right?
mm,
So, like, Giallo Antico or Porphyry, or these, I don't even know, Cipollino, all these different kinds of marble.
mm,
But part of that is assembling the empire, right? They bring in these marbles from across, like, North Africa or
mhm,
Greece or
mhm,
Egypt, right?
mhm,
That's part of assembling, right? We're pulling all that stuff into Rome, right? As a
mm.
form of almost ownership of the empire.
Yes.
And then they just dumped a whole bunch of paint on it that totally obscured the marble. Well, now, actually, what we have is, like, complex relationship between what's underneath and the color on top. But it's for sure it's not white.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, that's for sure. And as that realization has started to creep into how we reconstruct Rome, like digitally and whatnot,
Yeah.
yeah, and the people also aren't white, right? And so, and if you think about that, and that layering of color on the marble, it's like the layering of color and culture on people,
For
like
sure.
nuanced and complex. And
Yeah.
there's a absolutely great, if I could think of her name, there's a great geographer who, using, I think, 2014, it might have been a later census, but I think it's 2014, went into New York.
Mhm,
And if we abstract English and Spanish and look at what languages are spoken,
mhm.
I don't know, it's like 60. Like, and you can see them all mosaicked all over the place, right? But if you turn English and Spanish back on, you can't see that, right?
Mm.
So for us in antiquity, it's like if we turn on Latin and Greek, we never see the other languages.
That makes so much sense because you
right?
literally have to be walking down the street to hear it. Like,
Yeah,
because
you
I
do.
understand I'm a visual person, right? So as
Yeah,
you're saying that, I'm literally walking down the street in New York and I'm hearing everybody like speaking the languages, and like you have to be in the street to hear that. You know what I'm saying? Because they're talking
right.
to their friend, but if you go into the establishment and you talk to them, they're gonna start speaking English. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying? And so yeah, I can see it.
yeah. And the thing is about these blues, like a Julius Caesar or an Augustus. Augustus had like practically no interest in like wiping out that diversity. In fact, he's
Mm-hmm.
mostly like supported it. He reached down to middle and lower class Romans and like pulled them in even more,
Mm.
right? So he's kind of going around the elite that way.
Yeah.
I'll be patron of these middle and lower class Romans. They'll get free grain. They'll get like I'll support their labor unions, essentially their
Yeah.
collegia,
I have
right?
a
So
question.
he's yeah.
Question. So, like, what class is Julius Caesar? Like, is he born an aristocrat? So,
Yeah,
like,
he
why
is.
is he leaning towards the upper class? Is that seems like a gameplay or something? Like, is he not popular in the upper class? Like, what's going on?
Well, throughout, like the earliest, like the two guys really responsible for leaning into these issues of feeding poor Romans and redistributing land. They're called the Gracchi, Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually from two of the most leading aristocratic families in Rome,
Oh
like the
wow.
Sempronii, the Aemilii, the Scipiones, like these big families.
Okay.
Um, at the same time, though, they lean into what are problems here for the urban poor. And some people think they're just like demagogues, they're just exploiting that, right, to
Yeah.
build their careers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but certain families, and one of them emerges to be the Claudii. By the way, that's spelled by one of their most important members, Clodii,
Mm.
Clodius, because that was how it was pronounced on the street.
Ah.
So
Okay.
if you're aristocrat, Cloudy. If you're like on the street, Clodius, Clo,
Gotcha.
right? That's one of those little insights into how
Yes.
spoken Latin sounded depending on level. Like, you know,
Yes.
so anyhow, Julius Caesar, the Julii were not actually that big a family, like in all of Rome's history, but they
Mm-hmm.
emerge right towards the end of the Republic to become obviously really significant.
Mm-hmm.
And Octavian is actually adopted by Julius Caesar
Mm-hmm.
to be his heir,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then the heir of Octavian, who's going to be Tiberius,
Mm-hmm.
that's actually the son of his wife, Livia Drusilla,
Mm-hmm.
but from a former marriage to a Tiberius Claudius, right? And
Ah.
so it gets complicated genealogically, but like Augustus, he's like, I'm going to do a lot to support the middle to lower class. He like gives them jobs to do. He builds them up as leaders of neighborhoods. Like it's not like and all these poor people who are brown, they got to go, and
Right.
not at all, not at all,
Right.
right? And so that kept the aristocracy, the traditional aristocracy, angry at Augustus all the time.
Mm.
Nonetheless, he did just enough. He's like, I still need a professional political class,
Yes.
and you guys are it, right?
Hmm.
So right, and there's certain provinces that they govern, the ones without armies. The provinces that I govern are the ones with the armies.
Yeah.
So they get a job to do, but I still got the power, right? So
For
it's like this,
sure.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's this really nuanced way of trying, and it works for like 4 more centuries,
Oh wow.
right?
Yeah.
Because Augustus is like, we can just pick zero, like between BC and CE, we can just pick zero, right? Okay. Rome doesn't fall until like 400 CE. That's
Mm.
400 years of this system. It's got all kinds of stresses and whatnot,
Okay.
but it's that way of balancing for the people. Their input into the system now is through that guy,
Yes.
right?
Mm.
And so if that guy doesn't respect that, that emperor is going to be in trouble,
Right.
right? Because those what we view as like the mob of Rome, they're actually a lot of labor unions. What we would call them that. They call themselves collegia. They're like people in the same kind of trade, like building ships or
Mm-hmm.
moving ships around or laying bricks or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
right? That
Mm-hmm.
provides structure and organization,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the emperor is smart to interface with that.
Okay.
The emperor is dumb, right? Who does it,
Yes.
right? And so it's a to me that's like as fascinating. That's also super fascinating compared to the republic. I find them both fascinating,
Yes. No,
right?
for sure.
right? But no matter how you slice that experience, a lot of it is the experience of Black and brown people,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And that diversity, like when Julius Caesar put on games, it's noted that he put on the games in like 11 different languages,
Hmm.
right? So if people are upset because we don't have a traditional white cast for a classic play, hilarious, man. Julius Caesar put those plays on and made sure they were like in other languages.
That's dope. I didn't even know that. I had no idea.
Isn't that incredible?
That's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I have a random question, and then I have a question that I need you to answer in depth. Okay, so my
Okay,
random
right on.
question is: so I wondered, like, was there like some form of sign language then? Because surely there would have been deaf
Wow,
people
man.
and I would think because you know, there are a lot of languages, and I would think there were more languages then because
Yeah,
there's not as much communic. What am I trying to say? Because we're not as spread as we used to be. I feel like language is kind of condensed, but I would assume that
yeah.
there were way more languages then. So I would think that some type of hand signaling would be more popular than like a common language.
That is
So,
a fascinating question. And we can sort of maybe see some of that in things like Roman wall painting,
mm,
sometimes in sculpture.
mm.
Like, because gesture, I don't want to necessarily make it because Elon Musk and whatnot, but this happens a lot, you know? It has nothing to do with like Nazi Germany.
Okay.
God. But I got to say something about that. I mean,
Please
gestures,
do.
there's this vocabulary of gestures that we can't totally decipher. And sometimes they're on lamps and sometimes like things like that, like rough and ready objects that have figuration or figures depicted on them will have gestures. The reason I'm going to double back to Elon and that
Mhm.
gesture is because, part of the diversity of ancient Rome is its Jewish community.
Hmm.
And Romans like went into Judea, and it's a horrible near genocide situation. They destroy the temple. There's a Bar Kokhba revolt that's in like 120s. I think I'm pretty good on that. 130s maybe CE.
Mhm.
It's brutally put down by Hadrian. And there's this huge Jewish diaspora. But a lot of there's already a lot of Jews in Rome, and then a lot more.
Okay.
And there are like you'll find in Italy and like in Rome and in Ostia, the harbor city of Rome, there's synagogues,
Hmm.
right, in ancient Rome.
Okay.
And there's a lot of evidence of a Jewish community in the Trastevere region, the across the Tiber region of Rome,
Okay.
which is why it's also a hotbed for the emergence of early Christianity in Rome.
Hmm.
Okay.
Mhm.
So, but in Rome's like 15th, 16th century CE, like in the late Renaissance, early Baroque, that population of Jews is crowded into the Jewish ghetto.
Okay.
Right? And churches are built at all the entrances and exits, like this real attempt to convert them and confine them. Like it's super like racist. And
Wow.
so that happens, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
That goes away in, I'm going to say like the early maybe mid 18th century. It start like that gradually goes away, but the Jewish community remains in the ghetto. Like they don't all leave. It's a this concentrated Jewish area of Rome.
Mhm.
Once the violent confinement of them sort of fades,
Mhm.
but of course, when Nazi occupation happens, like it's really serious, right? And a
Mhm.
lot of Romans who weren't Jewish in Rome, like not a few stood up, right, and joined with the Jewish population,
Okay.
right? And so not everyone, certainly there's like a lot of like people who don't, but there are people who do.
Mhm.
And then in that same neighborhood now, there's a very large synagogue, like it's a monumental synagogue.
Mm.
And it's a testament to the toughness, the staying power of that community, its resilience, and also something now that Rome stands for, like Romans in Rome,
Mhm.
right? So when an Elon Musk makes a gesture like that, people in Rome are seeing that,
Mm.
right? And that's intense
Yeah.
because he's like making a joke out of that kind of history. So that history, I mean, the Holocaust is this incredible,
Yeah.
horrific moment in that history, but it's not the only moment,
Right.
right? And
Right.
so, and it's incredible because it's the very diversity of Rome that enables the birth and growth of the Christian community, the early Christian community in Rome. Like Christianity isn't native to Rome,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
brought there and it
Right.
and it grows there. And of course, Rome becomes this, center of Catholic Christendom.
Hmm.
But that reflects Rome's diversity,
Right.
right? And so that's why that like this whole Western European Christian situation. I'm like, what is going on here?
Right.
Right. And so
Yeah.
there's just so Elon Musk may think about Rome every day, but he has no like it must be ridiculous what the thoughts are.
He's thinking about the slippage of room. The slippage of room.
It's but it's yeah, so anyhow that's kind of a long-winded answer to
No, that
yeah.
was a great answer.
Okay.
That was a perfect answer. I have one more question for you because I know we're running towards the end of our time, and so there are two, and if you want to, you can merge them together. That's completely fine.
Okay.
Um, and they're basically based on a kind of the same thing. So as you know, my research search has led me to game design, which has led me to you, right? Interactive game design. How can we use game design techniques, methods, you know what I'm saying, to inform not only students but people, right? Just
Yeah,
inform
yeah,
people about reality and about what happened in a way that's not boring to them and in a way that they could walk away and like retain the information, because that's the other thing
yeah.
about teaching, right? How do we get them to retain the information? So first thing is like, of course, like if you could create anything and you had all of the money and all of the technology in the world, right? Like your dream Roman experience, you know what I'm saying, that we could have interactive experience. And then the other one is like a little bit more realistic, like what are you working on right now as
Oh,
far
okay.
as interactive educational projects are concerned, and what aspect of interaction are you highlighting, and why is that important to like the experience, you know what I'm saying, or to
Yeah.
maintaining that information, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. So the games are super important right now, partly because it's a time period when uh, black game makers, brown game makers, indigenous game makers, it's like a renaissance or maybe a first birth, not a
Mm-hmm.
rebirth, but a first birth
Mm-hmm.
of creators outside that sort of white norm. Um, and it really was a white norm for the creation of games. Well, of course, we forget this a lot, and it's a real problem, and that is South Korea and Japan,
Yes.
right?
Yes,
So there's already diversity there, but
for sure.
thinking about Europe and the Americas, there's just a lot more diversity in the indie game space, and the key to getting that diversity is just have more different people making games.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, we've had the emergence of engines like Unity and certainly Unreal now and Godot, where there's more access. Like
Mm-hmm.
people can use those engines in a way they just couldn't like 15 or 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's been really, really important, and it's something we have to support. And the question is how.
Mm-hmm.
And a key thing is also to recognize that games are not trivial.
Hmm.
Like many games are in their own right, they're art, and this is an art that indigenous or black or brown developers are going to push and pull and move in different ways that are like essential to enriching the medium, just essential to its future and to
Mm-hmm.
what it can say, because all those different diverse creators have different bodily experiences and political experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the way you see and the way your body is just not the same,
Yeah.
right, across that group. And
Yeah.
since games are an embodying medium, right, they make you feel like you're in the space doing things in the space.
Mm-hmm.
It's really important, it's essential to have these different bodies and eyes, like
Mm-hmm.
ways of seeing that are
Mm-hmm.
built into the creation process.
For sure.
For ancient Rome, first, like I would focus on Pompeii just because you have so much evidence.
Mm-hmm.
A and B, certainly diversity in Pompeii because we know it's there,
Mm-hmm.
and we know that from graffiti, we know it from names, we know it from like there's a house that has like three or four different artifacts from India
Hmm.
are like in there,
Mm-hmm.
and so there's just like there's a big Isis temple,
Hmm.
there. So it's like capturing that, and then the key is also making that accessible
Right.
so that it's not only a thing that a narrow audience of archaeologists downloads from Steam or whatever,
Right.
right? And mostly that's going to still be a white demographic and
Right.
upper class,
Mm-hmm.
right? So diversifying who can play,
Yeah.
like who gets access and can explore that world. And that brings like a phrase that sort of came out of what I was doing with Dora Vinarucci when Dora was here,
Mm-hmm.
is diverse proxy phenomenology.
Hmm.
And that is let's have diverse people play it. We know we're not them. Like we can't be Romans.
Mm-hmm.
But if the only people who play experience, and maybe we're gathering player data from that experience, if the only people who routinely get to go in our 3D Roman environments are white upper class people, that's not diverse, and the proxy isn't very good,
Actually.
right? So recognizing that I may read all the Latin I can possibly read, and I'm still not Roman, right? And I'm still only me. But if we can diversify who's experiencing that 3D space, then the proxy gets better,
Yes.
right? And the reason phenomenology is on there is because of the way games work, like that they're strongly experiential nature.
Yes.
So that's a two-parter, right? If I had all the money in the world,
Mm-hmm.
I'd really build something deeply based on Pompeii and make sure it had, like, probably make it web-based,
Mm-hmm.
right? Rather than a medium you have to buy or download from Steam, because
Yes.
that's already like a bare friction,
Yes.
right? And get as many people globally to be able to experience it. And of course, with consent and whatnot, like you right, but gathering player data about how they experience it
Yeah.
is such a can be such a powerful indirect lens on diversity in antiquity. That's
Yeah.
kind of, and so what am I working on right now? Something much smaller. It's a VR experience that's set in Ostia Antica, and it actually focuses primarily on, there's a dude who's been afflicted by witchcraft or magic, but that magic is being practiced by women, and the goddess of magic is female Hecate, and sort of the force that's going to balance these competing forces. Uh, and they're all among like the working class of Rome. The whole thing is set among the working class
Okay.
of Ostia Antica, like guys involved in like moving the boats around and stuff. It's
Okay.
not elite.
Okay.
It's like everyday experience, which we know had a bunch of magic in it. That's one of those like levels of belief that permeate the Mediterranean, but are diverse, like across it,
Mm.
right? And so there's spells being cast, there's amulets to turn aside spells, things like
Yes.
that.
Yes.
So we have that as part of the game,
Nice.
right? And then also the goddess that's gonna reconcile these people competing, fighting each other through magic
Mm-hmm.
is Isis.
Mm.
So, actually, right, who's a extremely important divine force in the lives of everyday Romans, like really
Okay.
important,
Okay.
touches their lives more than like the state gods of like Jupiter and Minerva or
Really?
whatever. Yeah. Yeah. So we wanted to pull that out, right?
Okay.
Right. Because that way, this is not a game about Olympian gods or elite people, right?
Right. Okay. I see. Yes. Okay.
Right. So we're having a lot of fun with that because, of course, magic is fun, but it's also one of those games where we want to have people be able to speak in a limit, like a short term kind of way, but with bots who can
Yeah.
respond in English for a lot of players, but also we want to make that like have some Latin in it. We
Yes.
haven't yet thought about other languages because that gets into real historical linguistics and under like languages that don't have much evidence, but we're
Mm.
just trying to think of how do we begin to think about conveying that linguistic
Yeah.
diversity. But for this game, English first, then Latin, then
For sure.
yeah, right,
Then more, right?
yeah, yeah.
And then
Because Ostia, the harbor city of Rome, we know it was incredibly diverse. They tell us
really,
so. You know,
that's really
we
cool.
are the rope makers from Sardinia. We are the ivory importers from North Africa. We are the wine importers from southern France. It's like literally they name where they're from, and it's like you could draw arrows all over the Mediterranean.
Wow.
All right, super cool.
That is cool. And that sounds like a fun game because you get to experience so many different cultures, or even like from surface level, right?
Yeah,
At one time, yeah. That's and it shows, like I said, like that New York energy, right? And the
yeah,
chaos of Rome, yeah.
yeah. And it's almost like a fight between who's going to control a labor union in New York.
Of course, yeah. I'm
It's
with
it's like it's like that kind of fight,
yes,
which carries overtones, if you don't mind me saying so, of organized crime.
for sure.
So that kind of rough and ready street politics for sure. And actually, a
Yeah.
series that got at that somewhat was HBO's Rome. It brought
Mm,
out that a little bit, right? But
right.
right, but um, it's still a little, like I would say, broad brush.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it doesn't capture the nuance of what that, like, people were not just violent
Right.
in this situation. Like there's a lot of calculation. I guess that's what makes the crime organized.
Right.
So we wanted to capture that sense of conflict at a more everyday level, but
Mm-hmm.
still at that level, the stakes are really important for the
Yes.
people involved, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, Thank you so much, Dr. Frederick, for
That's
coming
super
and
fun.
yeah, awesome. Yes,
Yeah.
and talking to us about what Rome was really like and some of the slippage and miscommunication and misunderstanding around cultural diversity in Rome and Western civilization in general. I would argue, right, kind of based on our conversation, right, that there was much more diversity there than we've been led to believe. So, thank you for this conversation and next time we'll have to talk more about games, right? I feel like we didn't talk like a whole bunch about games this time, but that's okay because the conversation was important. We talked a little bit about games, but
Well,
thank you.
thanks for having me. It
Of
was
course,
super fun, and yeah, games are fun too, along with Rome. So we
likewise.
we can talk about that more.
Sounds good. We coming for that entire